In World War II, every fifth soldier died. 20 million men turned into cannon fodder. 20-year-olds forced to attack without even rifles, waiting to grab weapons from fallen comrades' corpses. Picture the terror. Bullets whistling, your first friends falling dead, and you might not even be holding a weapon. But what happened when starvation drove them to cannibalism? During World War II, the biggest armed fight in history, around 110 million soldiers served on battlefields all over the world. More than 20 million of them died or passed away while captured. That's about every fifth soldier. This shows how huge the price was that this war demanded in human lives. Every single day, these people had to fight not just against the enemy, but also against harsh conditions. They faced freezing winters, burning hot summers, hunger, sickness, and fear that was everywhere. The life of an ordinary soldier on any side of the war was crueler than we can imagine today. In this story, you'll learn about the suffering that soldiers had to endure from morning until night, week after week. We'll uncover what their daily struggles looked like on the front lines, what they experienced when facing death, and how they dealt with being worn out in body and mind. For many young men, their war story began with a draft notice. Often they hadn't even celebrated their 20th birthday yet, and they already had to put on a uniform. Many joined up full of ideals, patriotic excitement, or worry about the unknown. But they quickly found out that real war had nothing in common with the romantic recruiting posters. After short training that barely prepared newcomers for frontline reality, came their first meeting with the enemy, and it was shocking. For example, young Soviet recruits thrown against the experienced German army in 1941 often lacked basic equipment. Sometimes a unit didn't have enough rifles for everyone, and inexperienced soldiers were sent into attack expecting to grab weapons from fallen comrades. Imagine that terror. Bullets are whistling around you, artillery shells are exploding, your first friends are falling dead or wounded, and you might not even be holding a rifle. The enemy is everywhere around you, and you're just cannon fodder. One desperate newcomer wrote in a letter home from the Eastern Front. The first battle wake-up call was cruel even for soldiers from better-equipped armies. Americans landing in Normandy in June 1944 discovered that even careful training couldn't protect them from the chaos on Omaha Beach, where hundreds of men fell within minutes. Beginner's luck didn't exist in war. A newcomer had the same chance as a veteran of being hit by a deadly bullet on his first day at the front. Many newcomers also experienced strong physical signs of fear during their first battle. Their hands shook so badly they could barely load their rifles. Others threw up or even wet themselves from terror. In such an overwhelming situation, this wasn't abnormal, even though many young men felt ashamed. Over time, they learned that even experienced veterans could have similar reactions under extreme stress. Despite the initial shock, most soldiers had to quickly pull themselves together and keep fighting. Soon we'll see what their daily life looked like when the battle quieted down and the endless struggle for survival in trenches began. When the shrapnel hell wasn't raging and immediate fighting wasn't happening, soldiers faced a different enemy, the monotonous, suffering routine of frontline life. Soldiers got up at dawn, often without enough sleep because they'd been on guard duty the night before or were woken by artillery fire. This was followed by a modest breakfast if there were any supplies at all. Every day followed the rhythm of cleaning weapons, digging trenches or foxholes, moving positions and waiting. And through it all, death was always lurking. A sniper could shoot at any unlucky person who carelessly peeked out of a trench, and bombers occasionally roared overhead. The conditions that frontline soldiers lived in were extremely primitive. Constant lack of hygiene led to floods of lice and diseases. Many didn't have a chance to wash properly for weeks or months. American infantryman and later writer Paul Fussell remembered that he went 6 months without a shower or clean clothes. Uniforms were torn and muddy, boots were soaked, and soldiers' feet suffered from so-called trench foot, a painful infection from constant wetness and cold. So soldiers helped themselves however they could. One American sergeant, for example, carried spare dry socks under his coat, and kept another pair under his helmet to dry them with his body heat. Every evening in the trench, he would massage his frozen feet, put on dry socks, and put the wet ones in his helmet to dry, but such tricks saved only a few people. Thousands of men on both sides of the front ended up with frostbite or infections, sometimes so serious that they needed amputations. Trenches and field shelters were also often overrun with rats and insects. Soldiers had to accept a horrible companion. Often dead bodies lay near their positions that couldn't be removed under fire. The sweet smell of decay mixed with the sharp odor of gunpowder and the ever-present latrines. The environment was like a nightmare, but men had to function in it day after day. Food was always cold and monotonous. Soldiers ate from metal mess kits when they had anything to eat. Common delicacies were canned foods, for example, British beef in its own juice nicknamed bully beef, American emergency K rations, and German military bread hard as stone. Fresh food almost didn't exist. Fruit or vegetables were rarities that soldiers only enjoyed when away from the front. When there was no fighting, days were surprisingly monotonous and long. Many veterans later said that war is endless boredom interrupted by moments of pure terror. To kill time, soldiers wrote diaries, got excited about every letter from home, and read it over and over. They played cards or just talked. That last thing kept them sane. Friendship and humor were often the only medicine against despair. If a unit pulled back for a while to the rear away from direct fighting, soldiers tried to catch up on sleep, eat their fill, and enjoy small pleasures like hot tea, a chance to bathe after a long time, or simple quiet without shooting overhead. Some soldiers were lucky enough to get a few days of real leave far from the front. The first day they usually slept and ate their fill of something other than field rations. Then they tried to enjoy the normal world, go to a pub, dance with a girl, in short, forget about war's hardships for a while. But even on leave, many were haunted by thoughts of comrades still fighting. But besides boredom and daily drudgery, soldiers also faced merciless elements: weather and nature. Soon we'll learn how cruel conditions could be. From Russian frosts to tropical jungles, nature didn't pick sides. Extreme conditions tormented all soldiers regardless of their uniform. On the Eastern Front, an unprecedented winter struck in 1941-42. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees and German soldiers weren't equipped for it. The German army had counted on quick victory before the frosts came, so winter gear arrived late or not at all. The Soviet Union was supposed to be defeated by lightning war, but instead German units had to stay in the Russian winter. Clothing froze right on soldiers' bodies and rifles froze to their hands. Frostbite cut down thousands of men. They often had to tear off frozen socks along with skin or lost toes. Desperate Germans put on anything they could find: blankets, sacks, women's scarves looted from abandoned villages, and even coats from fallen enemies. One German veteran from Stalingrad remembered seeing a group of retreating soldiers putting on anything they could find just to stay warm. One of the men suddenly fell into the snow and the others walked past him with frozen faces, as if they didn't even notice he had died. They were so numbed by exhaustion and cold. Spring and autumn Rasputitsa, the notorious Russian mud, was another enemy. Days of constant rain turned roads into endless seas of mud. Vehicles got stuck up to their axles. Horses and people waded through sticky clay, which delayed supplies and isolated units. One German officer bitterly noted in his diary in autumn 1941 that the twinkling lights of Moscow were within sight, but rubber boats might help their advance more than tanks now. He was referring to the sea of mud that trapped his division just a few dozen kilometers from their goal. But summer didn't bring relief either. In summer, the sun blazed and dust flew, and soldiers suffered from thirst. In North African deserts, temperatures rose to 50 degrees Celsius in the shade. Water was more valuable than gold. Each man got only a strictly measured daily ration, maybe just 2 liters for drinking and washing combined. Soldiers learned to drink hot water from field canteens full of sand that tasted like metal, but saved lives. Supplies had to be transported hundreds of kilometers in convoys across the Sahara. and when the enemy destroyed these convoys, critical shortages occurred. A British soldier in the desert remembered that it was considered punishment just to carelessly get sunburned. First, it endangered his health, and second, it wastefully used water that he then needed for recovery. At night, the desert turned into an icy kingdom. Temperatures dropped to freezing, and tired men shivered with cold because thin blankets weren't enough. Vehicles in the desert suffered just like people. Fine sand got into engines and main weapons. Equipment overheated and truck tires burst on the heated terrain. Sandstorms lasting whole hours were also feared. In fierce wind, tiny grains of sand turned into projectiles that scraped skin bloody and could sandblast equipment and vehicles down to bare metal. Soldiers had to bury themselves in depressions, cover themselves with tents, and wait for the storm to pass. Soldiers in the jungles of Southeast Asia and the Pacific fought against suffocating humidity and tropical diseases. Malaria, dysentery, fevers, all of these cut down armies perhaps more effectively than enemy machine guns. For example, on Guadalcanal Island, malaria affected over half of American soldiers at one point. Insects bit day and night. Ever-present mosquitoes and flies spread diseases, and soldiers often unknowingly drank contaminated water from the jungle, which reliably put them in bed with cramps. In the muddy rainforests of Burma, units waded through mud, their feet eaten away by constant moisture and skin covered with festering sores. One Japanese soldier complained in a letter that the jungle was hell, where you couldn't see the sun, but the humidity was so terrible that their uniforms molded right on their bodies. Added to this were poisonous snakes, leeches stuck to legs, and sounds of unknown animals in the pitch-black night. The psyche took a beating. Whether a soldier was freezing in trenches near Leningrad or sweating under the forest canopy in the tropics, everywhere he asked the same question: when will this end? But worse than weather's whims was the ever-present hunger and exhaustion. Soon we'll reveal how cruel the lack of food and basic needs was. Every soldier needs to eat to be able to fight, but in the chaos of war, supply often failed. Hunger became a constant companion at the front. Rations were limited everywhere, but toward the end of the war, in many armies, they shrank to ridiculous portions. For example, German soldiers surrounded at Stalingrad got only about 50 grams of bread per day in December 1942. That's less than one slice. Desperate men ate whatever they could. First, horses fell victim. As soon as one of the draft horses collapsed from exhaustion or was hit by shrapnel, soldiers immediately skinned it and divided the meat into pots. After horses came other animals, rats, cats, and dogs. One German sergeant described a chilling scene in a letter to his wife at the end of 1942. Yesterday we got a bottle of vodka. We had just killed a stray dog and the vodka went perfectly with it. Darling, I've personally killed and cooked 4 dogs and once even a magpie. This soldier cynically described his horrifying menu as if it were natural. But in the same letter, he also admitted that he considered Stalingrad a living hell and mass grave for his entire division. Starvation gradually destroyed bodies and morale. Men grew weak, their immunity dropped, and they lost the will to fight. There were even cases of cannibalism. A field doctor of the 6th Army recorded that some dead soldiers were found torn open with muscles cut from their bodies. Desperate, hungry comrades had carved off even the last scraps of meat. These were extreme cases of complete desperation. More common was soldiers getting sick from eating spoiled or completely unsuitable things. In Stalingrad, field hospitals lay thousands of soldiers slowly dying of hunger and disease with doctors unable to do anything for them. Even the Allies didn't eat like kings, although they had better logistics. For example, units of the American 101st Airborne Division, surrounded by Germans in Bastogne in winter 1944, had to survive on half rations for several days until supply columns pushed through enemy lines. The British in the desert made do for months with canned food and crackers, getting a cup of traditional tea served cold and without sugar. Soviet soldiers at the beginning of the war often suffered hunger. during chaotic retreats because they lost supply depots in fertile territories. Some wrote home that they fought for a piece of bread as fiercely as they fought Germans. During the siege of Leningrad, soldiers and civilians ate soup made from grass and leather scraps. Daily bread rations there dropped to 125 grams, and even that contained ground sawdust to give the bread volume. Permanent malnutrition led to complete exhaustion of the body. Soldiers at the front were often skinny to the bone with sunken faces and eyes surrounded by dark circles. Strength quickly faded. One Italian soldier in Russia noted, "We don't even have strength to lift our rifles anymore. We're so weakened by hunger and cold." You'd think that in such a state nobody could fight anymore. But war didn't wait for a soldier to be fed or rested. Soon we'll talk about what happened when a hungry and tired soldier had to face the enemy again. But the greatest cruelty lurked in actual combat. When firing began and a soldier rose from his foxhole to attack, he entered a world where only the law of survival of the fittest ruled. The war conflict of World War II reached unknown intensity. Machine guns spewed hundreds of bullets per minute. Artillery shells tore bodies to pieces, and long salvos from rocket launchers, the so-called Katyushas, could devastate an entire strip of land in moments. In such hell, an unprotected individual had nothing left but to crouch in a crater or lie flat on the ground and pray that no shrapnel would find him. Pure chance often decided. One veteran aptly noted that on the battlefield, luck is the only difference between life and death. Close combat was a complete denial of civilization. Bayonets, field shovels, or even bare fists when ammunition ran out, everything was used to stab or beat the opponent. In such fighting, war knew no mercy. Especially on the Eastern Front, a merciless attitude prevailed. The enemy wasn't trusted, and prisoners were often immediately eliminated. Many soldiers preferred to continue fighting to their last breath rather than surrender because they knew mercy wouldn't await them anyway. Moreover, brutality bred brutality. German occupiers committed horrible things to civilians in conquered territories, and Soviet soldiers then often cruelly avenged themselves on captured Germans. Similarly, on the Western Front, when SS units in the Ardennes in 1944 massacred dozens of helpless American prisoners, the Malmedy Massacre, many Americans then stopped showing mercy to captured SS men. Fear and hatred escalated to extremes during the war. For example, during the Battle of Moscow at the end of 1941, it was reported that only 10 wounded Soviet soldiers was carried off the battlefield. The rest were left lying in the snow and bled out or froze because nobody could reach them under fire. Similarly, in the Pacific, American units often didn't take Japanese prisoners since they saw that the enemy would rather blow himself up with a grenade than surrender. Those who did surrender and were captured were far from safe. In prisoner of war camps, often only a slower end awaited them. In German camps, about 2 to 3 million captured Soviet soldiers, over 3 million people, died from hunger, cold, and disease. Prisoners didn't survive much better in Soviet captivity either. Of nearly 100,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 returned home after the war. War simply treated those who could no longer defend themselves mercilessly. For surviving soldiers, the worst sights were of fallen comrades, especially when they were best friends. I saw my buddy next to me get hit in the chest, and he was dead in a minute. And I felt nothing at all. That scared me almost more than seeing that he wasn't there anymore. This is how one soldier described his numbness after getting to safety from the battlefield. In the rush of events, a person reacted instinctively and often suppressed all emotions. Otherwise, he would have gone crazy. But after battle, when Basensi came to him, the horror of the experience returned to the mind. Many tough guys who'd been through torn-up battles then fell into shock. They cried or couldn't speak when they saw what was left of their unit. Soon we'll learn what impact this continuous horror had on soldiers' minds and how they dealt with the trauma they carried from combat. The human mind has its limits, and World War II mercilessly tested them. Constant stress, lack of sleep, seeing death, and threats to one's own life. All of this took a cruel toll. For soldiers of various armies, the term battle fatigue gradually became common, or older terms like shell shock from the previous war reappeared. Today we would say post-traumatic stress disorder. At the front, it showed when a soldier simply psychologically shut down. He shook, lost the ability to speak or hear, fell into apathy, or began screaming uncontrollably. According to military doctors, every human psyche had a breaking point. American psychiatrists found that during intense fighting, most soldiers had psychological breakdowns after about 200 days at the front at the latest. During the battles of Monte Cassino and Anzio, Dr. John Appel recorded that practically all men in infantry battalions sooner or later became psychiatric cases, if they weren't killed or severely wounded first, so nervous breakdown awaited everyone. During World War II, just in the American Army, 500,000 soldiers suffered such serious psychological problems that they had to be removed from the front. This corresponded to about 40% of all medical evacuations, a huge number that surprised even command. And we're talking about Allied armies that had regular leaves and rotations of units from combat to rest. In the Red Army or German Wehrmacht, where soldiers often fought until they fell or were severely wounded. Internal stress must have been even more acute, even though psychological breakdowns weren't talked about there. Instead, such men were often labeled as fakers or cowards. Soldiers tried to cope with psychological pressure in various ways. Some turned to alcohol. For example, in the Red Army, the so-called Front 100 was issued, 100 grams of vodka daily as a nerve stimulant. But in reality, vodka only temporarily dulled the senses. Sometimes music or humor helped. Soldiers sang rough songs, told trench jokes full of black humor, often at their own command's expense, and wrote letters home where they downplayed reality so as not to scare their families. It often happened that a soldier got a tic, a crying fit, or hysterical laughter that couldn't be stopped. The soul was looking for an outlet. When someone really couldn't go on anymore, they took him to a field dressing station in the rear. There, doctors gave calming injections and allowed him 2 to 3 days of sleep away from the thunder of battles. Often the soldier then calmed down and in relative peace, realized he had to continue. If not for himself, then for the comrades who depended on him. Such a person recovered within limits after a few days, returned to the front. Others never recovered. After the war ended, many veterans suffered nightmares, anxiety, and post-traumatic episodes for many more decades. Soon we'll reveal yet another side of the cruelty of soldier life. Not just the enemy, but their own army could also harshly punish any hesitation. Let's look at discipline and punishments that kept exhausted men in battle. Warring armies also used tools of their own intimidation to maintain morale and obedience. Desertion, cowardice, or refusal to fight were punished strictly and as examples. In extreme cases, even with death sentences carried out immediately on the spot. For example, in Hitler's Wehrmacht, about 15,000 German soldiers were executed during the war for desertion, spreading panic, or refusing to fight. The Nazis resorted to harsh punishments more often as their soldiers became more exhausted and prospects for victory faded. At the very end of the war, still in May 1945, General Schorner had the last few cowards who wanted to flee hanged on the Eastern Front. In contrast, the British Army didn't execute a single soldier for desertion during the entire Second World War, and the Americans only one, the famous case of Eddie Slovik. But the Soviet Union probably had the harshest system. Stalin issued Order No. 227 in July 1942, known by the slogan, "Not one step back," which forbade retreat under penalty of death. At the same time, he established so-called blocking detachments, units placed behind their own soldiers whose job was to shoot anyone who ran back during an attack. During the first months of these measures, according to records, over 1,000 soldiers were shot and tens of thousands more were sent to punishment battalions. Punishment battalions were units composed of offenders, deserters, soldiers who had violated discipline, or even convicts transported from gulags. Soviet command deployed these detachments to the most dangerous sections of the front, practically to certain death. For example, during the liberation of Kiev in 1943, soldiers from punishment battalions went as a human shield before the regular army. Of 10,000, only a few hundred survived. It's estimated that Soviet military tribunals had up to 158,000 of their own soldiers executed during the war, a horror that has no parallel. For comparison, the French army handed down 102 death sentences and the British 40. Rarely carried out, totalitarian dictatorship went furthest in cruelty toward its own people. A different type of harsh discipline prevailed in the Japanese army. There, physical punishment was a daily occurrence. Non-commissioned officers routinely slapped and beat soldiers for the slightest offense or just on a whim. Japanese soldiers were raised for absolute obedience and fanatical devotion to the emperor. They were taught that surrender was the greatest shame and that the enemy was inhuman and would torture them after capture. That's why the Japanese fought to their last breath and mass capitulation was out of the question. It even happened that retreating Japanese units killed their own severely wounded because they had no medicine or strength for them and didn't want to let them fall into enemy hands. So cruel was the Bushido code that the Japanese army followed. Partly for these reasons, Japanese soldiers committed terrible atrocities on civilians and prisoners, especially in China and Korea, in an environment of total insensitivity to others' lives. Many witnesses of the Japanese campaign in China described how, after about a year of deployment, soldiers lost all restraints. They took murdering an unarmed Chinese person as sport, and somewhere bayonet training took place on living prisoners. This was all also a result of enormous pressure that each soldier's own militaristic machinery placed on him to turn him into a heartless machine. Those who didn't comply were themselves mercilessly crushed. So soldiers experienced cruelty not only from the enemy, but often from their own commanders. In the end, it seems that war itself was the greatest enemy of all. So in conclusion, let's think about what we can take from these soldiers' fate today. May 1945. On a bombed-out square somewhere in Central Europe sits a 20-year-old soldier in a tattered uniform. He's leaning against a cracked house wall with a scratched helmet on his lap. His name is Michael, and he survived the worst conflict in history. In his eyes is the distant expression of someone who has seen too much suffering. Memories race through his head, friends who fell beside him in battle, winter nights when he shook with cold in trenches near Leningrad, blisters on his feet from endless marches, hunger and thirst that plagued him for whole weeks, cries of the wounded that woke him from sleep. Michael feels relief that the hell is over, but also emptiness. War robbed him of 5 years of life, many friends, and illusions. Now he faces returning home to a world that may never fully understand his experiences. Michael slowly gets up and steps toward a new life. In his heart, he promises never to forget his fallen comrades. The stories of frontline soldiers from World War II are both terrifying and fascinating. On one hand, they reveal how extremely resilient the human spirit can be when facing unimaginable tests. Millions of men and women, because women also served in support corps and sometimes with weapons in hand, endured what no one could have imagined before, and many of them kept their humanity, friendship, and hope despite the hell around them. On the other hand, we shouldn't forget that war is the most violent and cruel creation of human civilization. The fates of soldiers from 1939 to 1945 still remind us today what price individuals pay for political ambitions and ideologies that start wars. After World War II, the world tried to learn. More attention began to be paid to the rights of prisoners of war, Geneva Conventions. Because during the Second World War, millions of soldiers died in captivity. Veterans' psychological trauma was also better understood. Today's military doctors already know what post-traumatic stress is, and armies have systems of rotations and leaves, so they don't expose soldiers to continuous deployment like before. Technical progress has ensured that soldiers have better equipment, medicine, enough food, and other support. even though they still suffer from cold or heat in the field. But war will never be a walk in the park. Even in current conflicts, soldiers experience fear, lose friends, and carry home scars on their bodies and souls. Let's therefore remember the stories of past generations of fighters, especially those from World War II. Wherever they fought, including thousands of Czechoslovaks in foreign units. This remains the bloodiest and greatest war experience of humanity. Let's remember that the peace we live in today is not a given. It was bought with the suffering and sacrifices of exactly these soldiers. Let's preserve their testimony as a reminder and warning for the future. Thank you for watching to the end. If this look into history interested you and brought new knowledge, I'd be glad if you give the video a like and share it with friends. See you soon for another story.